Nat Turner was there, standing on the edge of the cotton field with that pale moonlight spilling long shadows, like skeletal fingers that moved with the wind. The air was heavy, loaded not only with the smell of cotton, but also with the tension that seemed to whisper between the leaves. Every breath he gave was a rough reminder of years of suffering and humiliation. Every grain of dust that rose under his feet was a memory of the muffled screams that echoed on dark nights when the whip cut the air and the flesh. In those moments, Nat was not just a slave. Inside him was something that burned like an old fire, a certainty that made him believe that he was an instrument of divine justice, a voice that echoed beyond pain. The visions he had were so vivid that he could almost touch them, as if they were stone-recorded commandments. And that night, unlike all the others, what he saw was not a heaven of promises, but a red-dotted field, a blood and freedom. The words ran softly between the wooden walls of the senzala. Men and women whispered, exchanging glances of those who were no longer afraid, but a dangerous and desperate hope. Something big was about to happen, something that would change everything. It was as if the air was waiting to explode, silence before thunder. Nat gathered those who had hopeful courage to dream of him. They were all there, standing in the dark with eyes that shone like embers. There were Sam, with their confident, strong muscles and scars that told lost battle stories. There was Henry, who had the mark of 1,000 punishments on his shoulders, but still kept his look firm. And there was Hark, large as a bull, but with a heart that throbbed with every hopeful beat of freedom he wanted. Nat looked at each one of them, feeling the weight of the moment. Her hands trembled, but it was not in fear. It was the anticipation, the adrenaline that ran in his veins, mixed with the faith that kept him standing. He knew it was not just a matter of strength. It was a matter of belief, a conviction that divine justice was by his side. "They have the power of iron," he said, his low but confident, firm voice. "We have the power of faith." And with these words, silence enveloped them like a heavy blanket. It was the kind of silence that arrived before the storm, loaded with electricity, with an almost palpable expectation. Nat could feel the hearts of the men around him hitting unison with his, every pulse a promise that something big was about to happen. They knew this was the last moment of calm before chaos erupted. That night, as the wind whispered between the trees and the world seemed to hold his breath, Nat Turner and his companions were ready to light the fire that would change everything. In their hearts, the flame of revolt already burned, and they knew that when the first blow was given, there would be no return. It was a walk towards the unknown, but it was also a walk for hopeful. And at that moment, in that last breath of silence before the turmoil, they prepared to write their stories in blood and courage. The dawn of August 21, 1831, was marked by a silent restlessness. The sky seemed darker, as if the night itself knew that something terrible and grandiose was about to happen. Nat Turner, with his light steps, led men who, like him, carried in their souls the weight of a life of pain and humiliation. The cold wind of dawn was a cruel memory of freedom that had been denied to them for so long. As they approached the house of Mr. Travis, Each sound seemed amplified. The rustle of the leaves, the ranger of the tablets under his feet, the whisper of his companion's breath. When the gate opened, the crew echoed as a scream of freedom about to be conquered. Nat stopped for a second, looking at the house that symbolized years of oppression and suffering. He knew that every step toward the unknown was one step toward hopeful. Inside the house, the silence was dense, broken only by the light crackling of the candle that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Nat felt the sweat dripping over his face, mixed with the cold of dawn, but did not hesitate. With a quick and decided movement, he struck the first blow. The sound of the metal cutting the flesh was a suffocated cry of revolt that echoed in its veins. The life of the Lord Travis was gone there, and with it a little of the weight that had been suffocating Nat and his companions for so long. The metallic smell of the blood mixed with that of the candle, creating an almost unreal atmosphere. It was as if time had stopped, and at that moment all that existed was the pulsar of the accelerated hearts and the certainty that it was not coming back. The others followed Nat's example, their hands already calling for work now, wielded weapons that were both destruction and hopeful liberation to thee. When the dawn finally emerged on the horizon, dyeing the sky from a deep red, 7 bodies lay in the field. The silence of the dawn had been replaced by the murmurs of the wind, which seemed to whisper the word, hope, freedom. The dream that had been a distant hope for so long now became a dangerous reality. Each body on the ground was a price testimony that we're willing to pay for freedom. That day, the word freedom was no longer a fearful whisper among the walls of the Senzala, but a death sentence for those who dare to keep them chained. The rising sun illuminated the faces of men who, though dirty with blood and sweat, carried in their eyes a brightness of fierce determination. They knew that the way would be hard and that many would not survive. But at that moment, the only thing that mattered was that they had finally chosen to fight. Nat Turner looked at his companions, men who were no longer only enslaved, but confident, brothers of arms, in a serious struggle that would define their destinations. He knew that what they had started was greater than any of them. It was a cry of justice that would echo throughout America, a call to all those who still lived under the yoke of oppression. And so, with the first blade stuck in history, they went ahead, ready to face what it came. Each step they took was a confident challenge to fate, a promise that even if death awaited them, would die free. Nat Turner's revolt had begun, and with her a new era of resistance and courage. The cry of the currents echoed between the fields and the forests as a sound that did not silence, a constant memory of the hopeful struggle for freedom. Nat Turner's revolt grew, gaining strength and impetus with every step taken. Where they went, they freed those who, like them, lived chained by the weight of oppression. It was as if an uncontrollable flame spread, consuming everything he found ahead. The screams of those who had been whipped and humiliated until the previous day turned into shouts of war. It was a sad and powerful song, a symphony of confident resistance and courage that resonated in the hearts of those who joined the cause. Each new ally was a new spark, a new force that joined the revolt, expanding the chorus of voices that cried for justice. But as the revolt gained body, the floor shaved under the boots of the white militias that came from all the directions. The gentlemen soon reacted by sending armed men to stifle that rebellion that challenged his world of privilege and cruelty. The sound of horses' hooves and the tillint of arms announced the arrival of a fearful storm of violence. Men, women, and children, all those who carried the flame of freedom on their chest, ran with what they could. Pieces of wood, scythes, hoes, anything that could be used as a weapon was wielded with determination. They were not trained warriors, but the hope that shone in their eyes was a powerful weapon. Each face brought the mark of fear and courage, a mixture of emotions that only those who lived under the yoke of slavery could understand. Nat Turner, with a fixed look on the horizon, felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He was not just a leader, it was a symbol of hope for all those who joined the revolt. He knew the journey would be fearful and that many would not survive, but also knew it was no return. In a low voice, almost like a whisper for himself and his companions, he said, "If we die, to stand." Those words echoed in the minds of all who heard him. They were words of energetic resistance, a reaffirmation of the commitment to freedom. And so, with their hearts throbbing at the rhythm of the fight, they prepared to face what was coming. Fear was throbbing in his breasts, but the confident will to live free was overcome any hesitation. They knew they were more than enslaved. They were warriors in a battle against an oppressive system. The night came down on them like a heavy veil, but did not bring the rest. Instead, it brought the preparation for the inevitable confrontation. As the wind blown cold, carrying the smell of earth and sweat, the preparations were still silent. Each one knew what was at stake and what the price of freedom would be. The militias approached, and the sound of war drums became louder. The confrontation was about to start, and the tension in the air was almost palpable. Bravery was the only certainty they had, and even if the future was uncertain, they were ready to face him with his head held high. In that makeshift battlefield, the struggle for freedom gained new contours, and the story was written with blood and resistance. And so, when the first ray of sun broke the horizon, illuminating the determined faces of those who were ready to fight, the world changed once again. Nat Turner and his companions were there, firm in the promise that if that were his last battle, at least it was a battle for freedom. And with that, the revolt continued, a cry that could not be silenced, a scream that would echo through the ages. The blood already covered the streams, and the once fertile earth now exhaled death. The rebellion had taken whole counties, and the winds brought with them the sorry for those who suffered. Nat Turner, with a heavy heart, knew that the South's response would come with fury. The fearful storm of violence was soon arriving, a relentless and inhuman force that did not know mercy. The militias arrived as a swarm, invading the senzalas with a brutality that only the thirst for power and the fear of the unknown could justify. There was no distinction between guilty and innocent. It was enough that the skin was not their color, so that the death sentence was decreed. It was a massacre, a blind and cruel revenge against those who dared to dream freely. The bangs of the shots echoed through the forests and fields as thunder of a storm that seemed to have no end. Each shot was a reaped life, a cry suffocated by injustice. The bodies of men and women who hitherto believed in the promise of a different tomorrow now hung from the trees, their faces in sepulchral silence, while the wind made the leaves whisper sad songs. The trees, which once offered shadow and shelter, were now silent witnesses of indescribable horror. The bodies shook like macabre flags of resistance and sacrifice, each telling a story of courage and struggle. The smell of blood and gunpowder mingled with that of desperate, desperate prayers, murmured by those who could still find strength to beg for a miracle. Nat watched from afar, hidden between the shadows of the forest, as he saw his companions fall one by one. The man who challenged an empire now carried the weight of 100 crosses, each heavier than the other. In his chest, the pain of losing friends and siblings was like a nailed knife, and his mind boiled with the helplessness of not being able to save them. He knew he couldn't afford to stop. There were still those who had him, who needed his leadership and strength to continue fighting. But at that moment, hidden in the darkness, Nat felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He thought of his mother, his childhood, and the visions that led him there. What did the gods want him now? Had they turned against him, or was this more proof of their faith? The nights were long, and the cold of dawn became even more sharply as hope was gone. Nat's eyes, previously full of determination, were now blurred with pain and tiredness. Each new news of death came like a blow, and with every name he heard, one more piece of his soul seemed to shatter. But even as he fell to his knees, exhausted and desperate, Nat still found a hopeful spark of resistance within him. He knew that, despite everything, the fight could not stop. Those who died could not have left in vain. Freedom, even distant, was still a hopeful dream that needed to be persecuted. He stood up, with his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the dawn began to dye the sky from a deep red, reminding him of the spilled blood and the sacrifice of so many. Nat Turner's revolt had not been in vain. He was a man marked by suffering, but also by courage. And as the sun rose, he promised himself that he would continue to fight, not only for him, but for all those who believed in the promise of a world where freedom would not be just a dream, but a hopeful reality. Even though the path was covered in shadows, he would walk with his head up, carrying the legacy of resistance that could never be erased. For weeks, Nat Turner lived as a shadow, moving between the holes and marshes he knew so well. Each step was calculated. Each sound was a threat that he could not ignore. Hunger has become a constant company, an acute pain that eroded its stomach more than the very fear of capture. He fed on what he found, roots, leaves, anything that could fool hunger for a few more hours. The cold of the dawn passed in the open made his bones heavy, but he knew he needed to continue, that his capture would mean the end of more than just his life. The sound of hunting dogs was a fearful nightmare that was repeated every night. They were always there, in the distance, barking and sniffing, guided by the men who wanted their heads. The noise of the paws on the damp earth and the shouts of the forefront echoed like thunder in their mind. He knew it was just a matter of time, that the hunt would not cease until they captured him. But even so, Nat clung to the hope that he could somehow escape, that he could continue our fighting for one more day. And then, on a morning when the fog was so dense that it looked like a second skin, they found it. The sound of dogs was closer, more threatening, until he could no longer ignore. Nat was exhausted, the body betraying his desire to run. The tiredness dominated him, and he knew he couldn't go very far. When the soldiers appeared between the trees, he could not resist. I knew there was nowhere to run away. Nat's hands were tied with a thick rope, the same rope that he has seen so often to be used to whip and punish. The friction against his skin made the blood start to run slowly, but he didn't care. There was a strange calm in his heart, an acceptance of fate that he knew to be inevitable. Nat lifted his eyes, finding his cold eyes from his captors. They laughed, convinced that they were facing a defeated man. But Nat, even at that time, was confident not an overdue man. "You can kill the body, but not the idea," he murmured, his voice hoarse but firm. The soldiers laughed even louder. For them, he was just another delirious black man, a man who had lost everything and had nothing more to lose. But Nat knew he was planting a seed, an idea that could not be exterminated as easily as his body. Loaded between the fields that were once his home and his arrest, Nat kept his head up. He did not give his tormentors the satisfaction of seeing him broken. In his heart, he hopefully carried the hope that even if his body were destroyed, the revolution he had begun could not be detained. The idea of freedom, once on, would never be erased. For the story, what happened that day was the beginning of something that even the whip could erase. Nat Turner became a symbol, a martyr whose courage would hopefully inspire generations. And as the soldiers took him, unaware that they were carrying more than a man, they could not imagine that they were also carrying an idea that would live, grow, challenge. Even in the silence of death, Nat Turner was and always would be a cry of confident resistance and hope. Nat Turner's trial was a quick staging, made with the characteristic coldness of the powerful who want to demonstrate strength through cruelty. The small room of the court was crowded with landlords, harsh and cold men, who waited impatiently the confirmation of the sentence. There was no room for mercy. Nat knew that this was the inevitable outcome of his journey, but he remained firm, with the same look that he had carried throughout the revolt. When the death sentence was rendered, there was no surprise. The murmur among those present was of disgusted approval, a disgusted relief that spread like a disgusted plague. For them, Nat Turner was a symbol of chaos and disorder, something that needed to be exterminated so that their reality of oppression would keep intact. But on the other side, in the dark corners where the slaves gathered to whisper hopes and forbidden dreams, Nat was a hero, a martyr whose courage could not be silent. The execution was aggressive. Nat's body was taken to the public square, where a crowd gathered to watch the macabre show. You were there, with their steel looks and satisfaction smiles. They wanted to show everyone what happened to those who dared to challenge the system. They wanted fear, to spread a fire so that no other enslaved dare to follow the same path. The executioners had no pity. Each Nat member was torn with the same aggressive violence with which he had fought for freedom. His body was quartered, his parts displayed as disgusting trophies, a warning of what would happen to anyone who dared to dream freely. But what they could not predict was that that shed blood would not be erased so easily. Nat Turner, even in his death, continued to live in the hearts of all those who longed for justice. The news of the rebellion and the execution of Nat spread like fire across the country. You, who previously felt invulnerable in their opulent mansions, now slept with an open eye, fearful that the revolt could be repeated. Each shadow was a conspiracy potential, every whisper a possible insurrection. The fear that Nat Turner had inspired by the powerful would never abandon them again. For the enslaved, Nat Turner's story has become a legend, a source of inspiration and courage. In the cotton fields, in the muffled senzalas, his name was hopeful, whispered as a prayer, a reminder that freedom was a possible goal, even distant. Nat's blood had become seed, planted in fertile lands of resistance and hope. Every look that rose harder was a tribute to the man who had challenged the impossible. The years passed, but Nat Turner's memory never died. He had become symbol of resistance, a lighthouse for all those who fought oppression. His courage had exposed the cracks in a solid, believed system. The fear of the powerful was never the same again, for the idea of freedom, once planted, could not be erased. While the winds of change blew over the decades, Nat Turner's story continued to resonate. In every protest, in every march for rights, his spirit was present, reminding the world that the struggle for justice is eternal. Nat Turner did not survive that brutal execution, but his legacy lasted, stuck in the hearts of all those who refused to accept oppression as a destination. And so, with each new generation that raised against the currents of injustice, the flame he had light up continued to illuminate the way to freedom.